They say that history is the greatest of all teachers, and that tales of past deeds define who we are in the present, and what we shall be in the future. It is said that such tales shall, with each telling, illuminate us all with the light of truth. I shall tell you of such a tale. It is a tale quite familiar to me, for I have spent nearly a lifetime piecing it together and chronicling it here within this book. For years I have pondered its passages, studying every line, committing each word to memory. Perhaps now, in the telling of it, I shall at last find the answers I seek.
Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. We've looked at the CRPG which revitalized the franchise, we've seen what happens when they focus on the writing and world above everything else, so now let's see what a CRPG can do when it focuses on combat with Icewind Dale. When Icewind Dale was released, it had a serious mountain to climb, not least because it would end up being compared to Baldur's Gate 2 and Planescape Torment. In light of that, rather than trying to mimic what had already been done, they focused more on the combat over the role-playing aspect, and though very few saw it as an improvement over its predecessors, it was still well received in its own right. Where I was concerned, the focus on combat had me simultaneously intrigued and worried. On one hand, it would be an interesting departure, as there's a lot you can do with D&D's combat system that would be fun to explore. On the other hand, the story and role-playing are the main reason why I play CRPGs, and if those elements were overly neglected, I was concerned that the game wouldn't be as immersive or interesting as I'd like. So the question for me was whether or not the role-playing aspect was still serviceable, and if the game could win me over by virtue of its combat. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Since the gameplay is taking center stage, let's start there. The last couple of times I've looked at a CRPG, I've started the review off by giving a long explanation for how the combat operates, so that a newcomer can have a better grasp of what's going on. However, I've decided to not include one in this review due to the simple fact that if you don't already know how CRPG or D&D combat works, I can say with 95% certainty that you're better off playing one of this game's predecessors. To put it simply, the game seems to assume that you already know what you're doing, as unless I missed something, there's no tutorial area or explanation as to what you're supposed to do. On top of that, instead of just creating a single protagonist who acts as your avatar, you instead create your entire party right off the bat, meaning you have complete control over every facet of your group. That level of control is great if you know what you're doing, but can easily be overwhelming if you don't. As a result, I'll be following the game's assumption that you know how the combat works, and if you don't, then feel free to keep watching, as I've kept the jargon to a minimum and hopefully my opinion will still be interesting to listen to. With that out of the way, let's lay the groundwork for how I approach the game. I'm pretty familiar with how CRPGs and D&D operate, but I would not call myself an expert since I'm not a min-maxer who has to have the perfect arrangement. Often when I'm playing a game, I like to find a consistent strategy that's useful for almost any circumstance, as I'm a creature of habit. That unfortunately means a lot of the more creative aspects are likely to go unnoticed in exchange for a strategy that I can consistently pull off. For the purpose of this game, it turned out relatively okay, but more on that later. As for the team I use, they should be up on the screen, and the first thing most of you will probably notice is the lack of a bard character. Going into this, I saw a couple recommendations that I include one, and given the items I found, I can definitely see why, though I'm not sure who I would replace within my party. Maybe my mage cleric or druid? Either way, I also saw recommendations that you don't need a full-blown thief, though given that I used him as an archer for much of the game, I don't know how much of a difference it would have made. Regardless, there's the team I used, and that is the context in which I experienced the game. I didn't use too many consumable items, be they wands, potions, or scrolls, and for the most part, the balance seemed about right. And honestly, that's something that really impressed me. One of the dangers of giving us full control over our party is that the onus is now on the player to set up something that will succeed or fail. The designers can set up a fair number of encounters and will generally know how much experience a party will have in a given section, but when you have this much variance, it seems like game balance would end up being a crapshoot more often than not. And yet, for all the faults that I'll get into later, it's really well balanced despite both that and the rule set they're constrained by. One of the key things that really works are the, for lack of a better word, boss encounters, where you face a much more difficult or unique challenge than you did before. The vast majority of these are really well done, forcing me to more carefully consider how I was approaching a given situation. In cases with lots of archers, it meant I had to be more mindful of where my lower health party members were, and meant I had to balance sending my paladin and ranger up there to distract them, without said characters sticking their neck out too far. In the case of another encounter, it was a powerful mage who kept teleporting around a small enclosure, meaning it was a matter of trying to mitigate both the damage he was throwing around as well as all of the disruption spells he kept using to lock down and isolate my party. Hell, I'm pretty sure I won that one by accident, simply by hiding in a corner and letting his defensive spells run out before going after him. There was also a surprising amount of creativity put into the scenarios, such as a crypt where some of the monsters will randomly teleport your party members somewhere else. In that case, I ended up really low on spells and had to be very careful as to how I proceeded. It was both a good reminder as to how many tricks I actually had up my sleeve, and a decent challenge that emerged relatively organically. Unfortunately, while there were a lot of really great encounters, they were tragically outnumbered by a drove of uninteresting combat. To be fair, this in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, and can work to a game's advantage. In order for something to stand out, there is a degree to which it needs to be compared to something else, and having those ordinary encounters would provide a baseline for the really good ones to shine. The problem is that you have to be very careful as to how much of each you put in a game, as in this case, there's way too much filler and not enough killer. The overwhelming majority of the time I spent playing this wasn't on combat I found interesting, but instead on those generic encounters, and as a result the game felt like a chore, where the pacing is bogged down by the game's inability to do anything interesting until you get to the one point where you maybe get to continue the story or find a challenge, only to then find yet another large room waiting for you. It's so tedious that you could honestly shave off a fifth of the combat and I don't think I would even notice. To that end, some people would say that it's not as simple as just removing encounters or making ones that are slightly more interesting, as you have to be aware of how much experience you're giving to the party. My problem with that idea is that if it's a matter of balancing the experience numbers, what's stopping the developers from tweaking the numbers in the backend or changing certain things to make a given circumstance more interesting? And before any purists get mad at me for wanting them to tamper with the D&D rule set, let me be clear about something. I have no inherent problem with D&D's combat, in a tabletop setting. In that case, you have no idea how things are going to go. The element of randomness adds a degree of suspense, and you have both your friends and a dungeon master to play off of. When the dungeon master is a computer and you have the save button to try again, that element of randomness and the strictness by which the source material is supposed to be respected end up being hindrances. The system should be in service to the game, and if it's the other way around, you end up with games like this where you don't have enough room to maneuver, where you have to throw waves and waves of monsters just so that the PCs are ready for your set piece. And that's where I think a lot of people are going to disagree with me, as while D&D's combat system serves a purpose in a tabletop environment, I don't find it compelling in a video game due to the limitations that are already in place by virtue of that system, further being compounded upon by the limitations of a digital medium. That's not to say that I can't see the value in it, and in those tougher fights I did enjoy figuring them out, but when push comes to shove, I play CRPGs for the role-playing aspect. I had a feeling that I would have some issue with Icewind Dale because of that fact, but I didn't expect to find it as tedious as I did, to where it's taken me over a year to finally hunker down and finish it. But even if the combat were tedious, and even if I ended up not liking it all that much, I could at least deal with that fact if the story was told in a more compelling manner. Now before too much is implied, I actually do like the story, or rather stories given that the version I have came bundled with both expansions. The main campaign centers around some evil lurking on the periphery, which you have to seek out and prevent from causing mayhem to Icewind Dale as a whole. It's generic, but there are enough unexpected moments and interesting characters to where I was curious to see how it would turn out. The Heart of Winter expansion centers around a barbarian king who has supposedly risen from the dead due to the spirit of someone the barbarians care about. Unfortunately, said barbarian king is also interested in making war on a small group of settlements, which means you have to go in there and sort things out. Again, a relatively generic storyline, but there was enough intrigue within the town you find yourself in, and plenty of interesting encounters and lore to explore within that setting. Finally, the Trials of the Lore Master sends you to a ruined castle, where your goal is to simply escape. It's a simple premise, but you get to learn a lot about the castle and its former inhabitants as you go, and the poems the Lore Master gives you are really well thought out. So on the whole, the stories are fairly generic, albeit sometimes unpredictable, but for the most part, I don't mind generic so long as it's well executed. The Forgotten Realms setting may invoke a lot of stereotypical fantasy tropes, but there's a reason why they became so popular, and so long as they're done well, I have absolutely no problem with them. Hell, BioWare has been making their living by telling generic stories in a compelling manner, so I can hardly fault this game for following their lead in that regard. To go into more detail, a fair number of areas have their own little eccentricities that might not make much of a difference, but add a fair amount to the world as a whole. The characters are simple, but believable, and when voices are added to a character, it is top-notch. It's a little distracting in a couple of cases because I can't separate Jim Cummings from his more eccentric roles, but even though he's given more solemn characters this time around, he still does a good job. Hell, that range is why I like him as a voice actor anyway. The art and music are also spectacular. I didn't take much time to look at the artwork since that I tend to see it as a backdrop rather than a key feature, but when you step back and really look, they added in a lot of detail, to where I'm curious to see whether the art team or development team finished first. And when it comes to music, it's hard to go wrong with Jeremy Soule doing what he does best. It's booming and epic when it needs to be, it's solemn and peaceful when it needs to be, and it adds a lot to the atmosphere overall. My only complaint there is that it doesn't seem to loop all that often, which means there will be entire sections that don't have much playing and will feel oddly empty as a result. I can understand wanting to let ambient noise in the current circumstances provide all the atmosphere you need, but in this case it feels like something's missing due to past experience with CRPGs, especially since there isn't all that much ambient noise to begin with. All of this sounds really great and something worth seeing for yourself, but if that's the case, then why would I lead this section by wishing the story were told in a compelling manner? Well, the problem is that the writing, which to me makes up the core of a CRPG, is also the game's Achilles heel. Normally in a video game, the writing isn't something that I focus too much attention on, because while I can know when something is good or not, I often have trouble expressing why. In those cases where I can't articulate how something does or doesn't work, it then raises doubts as to whether it's actually worthwhile criticism. So my usual rule of thumb is to just give general impressions rather than serious critique. In this case though, since I've played this game's predecessors, I can now more easily point to exactly what the problem with the writing is. It's too generic. And I know that sounds weird because I just spent a decent amount of time explaining that I'm usually okay if something's generic so long as it's well executed. The difference here is that the writing is the execution. It's what drives the story forward. It's how the characters express themselves. It's the flavor text that highlights what you're seeing, and if done right, ties everything together in a really compelling way. That's not to say the writing is bad, but it does take the wind out of the game's sails at almost every turn. The main reason for this seems to be due to the game's vocabulary. For the most part, they don't stray very often from using generic terminology. In some cases, this means there isn't as much emotion as there could be, as they use words like area or surroundings instead of being more descriptive. For instance, there's one place where someone you meet played dead after being attacked by a group of snake people. They say they couldn't have won the battle, but there wasn't much of an indication as to why. Were they injured? Were they caught out in an open field where there was nowhere to run? Were they on a cliff face where the only escape would have been a sheer drop-off? Or were they simply outnumbered, as what seems to be implied? There's a lot more detail that could be given and a lot more fleshed out, but instead we get a lot of flat descriptions that don't tell us all that much. There's still plenty of moments where there can be an emotional impact, especially where voice acting is involved, but it's a lot less interesting than it could have been. Where it really bothers me is due to the fact that they rely on D&D terminology to shunt those details aside. It could be meant to evoke a dungeon master speaking to a player, but since this is a video game where the dungeon master is a computer, it feels out of place. The two biggest offenders in this are the words item and trap, because both of them evoke a sense of what something might be, but aren't very descriptive in and of themselves. Within the context of an RPG, items can mean anything from a wand to a piece of armor to a sword to a scroll and so on and so forth. Using it as a descriptor doesn't really give us much to go off of, or a sense of how valuable said items might be. When it comes to traps, this is meant to evoke a sense of danger, but not all traps are created equal. Are they magical runes, poisoned darts, swinging blades, pressure plate activated automatons? What are we dealing with here? What kind of perils are hidden behind these traps, and why should I care that you managed to get past them if I can't judge the full danger of said traps? I mean, I know they're gay, but that's about all I know for certain. Well, the traps are anyway, the people who fall for them might not be, but you get the point! Even then, with the writing not being as good as I would have liked, I wouldn't mind so much if my ability to roleplay wasn't needlessly constrained on top of that. In some part, it's because we create our entire party instead of a single character, which means there already may not be as much investment in a single character, and therefore no character dynamics within the party itself. There's no backstory to examine, no real setup for why the characters you create are there outside of cookie-cutter biographies, which means you have to fill in a lot of blanks for yourself. To be fair though, that comes with character creation in a typical D&D setup, and can be really empowering if you're given enough of a leash to run wild with. However, the game makes all sorts of limitations in the dialogue that needlessly constrain your ability to do that. Often the dialogue boils down to either gathering information, sometimes veering into investigation, sometimes requiring you to make some kind of value judgment, with the rest of it assuming, oh, this character's a paladin, therefore they're going to act like this. Excuse me, can you let the actual player have a say in the character they set up? Is that too much to ask? There's so much expository dialogue written into each option that it doesn't feel like I'm roleplaying a character I created. It feels like I'm roleplaying an archetype that the designers expected people to play as. And when you give us that much freedom in character creation just to constrain it in practice, it feels like a bait and switch that didn't need to happen. So yeah, in case it isn't obvious, I'm really conflicted on whether to recommend the game or not, because while I can't say it's a bad game, I can't say it's a good one either. On one hand, there's a lot that I really like. The art and music are excellent, there are a lot of really great encounters, and while the story was fairly generic, it still managed to catch me by surprise every once in a while. On the other hand, the sheer volume of combat that ranges from boring to tedious, coupled with writing that doesn't do the scenario justice, meant that for the vast majority of the time I spent with this game, I wasn't enjoying it, to where over the course of the year it took me to finish it, 2 other RPGs were able to swoop in and steal the game's thunder. And before it's said, I'm aware that comparing the game to other RPGs may not necessarily be fair, as for a review that's trying to be objective, I should be able to look at the game on its own merits. However, to some extent, there will always be those biases, and if I weren't honest about those, it'd be more difficult for you as the viewer to know where I'm biased and where you might need to do further research. And even if the 2 RPGs I showed on the screen aren't directly competing with Icewind Dale, the simple fact is that pretty much every game we have is competing in some way not just for our money, but also for our time. And the fact that it did take me this long to finish it should give an indication as to how worthwhile it felt for me to play it. What's worse is that, even beyond my personal opinion, I can respect that people who love CRPG combat will likely get a lot more out of this game, as they'll be more forgiving of the flaws than I am, and can be more creative with their party and toolkit. However, I'm even less inclined to recommend it because of how it's being sold. When I got this game, it was still possible that you could buy the original on its own, but now the only way you can directly buy it is also by purchasing the Enhanced Edition. I can understand why that would be the case, as according to what I've heard, the improvements that come with the Enhanced Edition are primarily technical, and there are points where some of that would have been welcome. However, any business decision that reduces consumer choice doesn't sit right with me, as it means if you want the original experience, warts and all, you have to give money to a studio that didn't originally create it, for a product you might not want, while also paying a premium for something you don't necessarily care about. The game was already a hard enough sell as it was, but because of how it's being sold, I'm afraid that I cannot in good conscience recommend Icewind Dale unless you already own it, and even in that case I don't know how interesting it'll be unless you really like CRPG combat. And that's a shame, because there are a lot of really great moments that are on par with its predecessors, but they're so awash in mediocrity that it's really hard to justify the grind required to get to that point. Either way, regardless of whether you agree with me, thank you for watching all the same. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for hopefully more lighthearted videos in the future. It's funny actually. One of the unspoken rules of this series is that I tend to pick games that are critically acclaimed or historically significant, as I find they're the interesting ones to pick apart and talk about. I guess it was inevitable that I'd find one that I didn't like as much, but I guess for now the best thing I can do is to keep moving forward. So, after reviewing 2 RPGs within a 2-month time period, I'm gonna go find something a little shorter to start chipping through, and we'll see you all later.